Thank you very much indeed. I think we have been through an interesting discourse during this day today, that I'm not just the only one that advocates for smart approaches to the challenge of shrinking areas, or shrinking regions. And I believe that what we need to observe also, that comes clear from the project analysis itself, also from the many debates and discussions and presentations over the day, has been that we face a diversity of shrinking, right? So we have a lot of cases with both simple and complex determinants for shrinking. We also are aware of many potential possible typologies related with shrinking. So no area, no region is alike in that sense. We may group them into certain classes, into certain taxonomies, but after all, there is the specific area that is in need of some sort of policy measures. We also need to, and I have to refer to the many interventions I've heard during the day, we also need to be aware of the importance of time, space, and governance. So this is a very dynamic situation. Some areas have been shrinking constantly, some others just recently, so they are on a reverse trend from growing to shrinking, whereas the other ones go in the opposite direction, from shrinking to growing. And it's important that before we take any policy measures, we need to understand what's behind, what kind of reasons, what kind of factors speak for the very phenomenon of shrinking in the specific area. What might be really striking is that, as it seems, and this was also articulated in one of the presentations, improved accessibility and higher financial support are not enough to counteract shrinking. So one would say this is absolutely obvious. We have to take care of the better accessibility, the physical accessibility of the space in question. We need to provide more money, more financial incentives, be it through the cohesion policy or through the sectoral policy instruments, and then the area will be well off. But I think this is not the case again. This is the people that actually decide. They are mobile enough to decide what they want to do with their life. So, and that is why we talk about smart approaches, a combination of smart mitigation and smart adaptation to, well, address the problem of shrinking. And I think this is a common denominator. We can't live with just one, be it the mitigation or adaptation. We shouldn't have this sort of, Hamlet situation, to live or not to live, but we could try a combination of both. What is encouraging is there is a growing awareness of a need for multi-level governance and also territorial governance. I use the two dimensions of vertical and horizontal in that sense, that the governance should not be just constructed bottom-up and top-down, but also to embrace the functional area, to understand that, well, there are certain reasons for shrinking that lie just behind the administrative borders of a municipality or region in question. So we need to understand what drives, what pushes, what pulls, and so on, the process of the shrinking. But as I mentioned, I think that's important that the first step as to regards who is involved in the process of creating a policy to mitigate and adapt to the shrinkage is the matter of changing the policy paradigm, meaning that we need to accept shrinkage as it is. It's probably not possible to, counteract it. We could mitigate it, which is, I think, a less drastic formulation. Mitigation implies that there will be a certain negative process ongoing still, but we can alleviate probably the consequences of shrinking. And adapting means that when we understand the reasons behind, that we do whatever we can in order to, for the people that decide to stay or decide to migrate into that area, that we create conditions for them to flourish and bloom. This brings me to this question of the quality of life in the specific place, which is also a matter for ESPON investigation as laid out during the Slovenian presidency, so the one after the Portuguese one that we dwelt on to discuss the concept of shrinking areas. So the quality of life for the people, for all people in all places, is a motto that we need to understand while designing the policies. So accepting shrinkage is this important aspect that we need to learn and educate the people, the policymakers. It's nothing shameful. It's as it is. We need to change the meaning, the negative meaning of the word shrinkage into something that is actually a neutral or a positive thing, to shrink, but still to capitalize on the shrinkage in a smart way. At the same time, I think the policymakers will have to have a realistic level of ambition. So of course, everyone would be the brightest, the most intellectually apt, but we have to understand what are the resources, what is our indigenous capital that we can bring into this picture. So what is that we can realistically achieve by designing, implementing policies that address the question of shrinkage in whatever way. This is just to set the scene, I believe, for discussion. And as we have very competent people on the panel as well, it would be great also to hear your opinions from more practitioner point of view, but also from the researcher point of view on that issue. Thank you for the time being.
Thank you very much for your intervention and your emphasis on the fact that better targeting does not only mean defining better perimeters and accumulating knowledge about places, but also listening to the needs of the needs of people and being reasonable in ambitions and being clear in the choices we have to face. And thank you also for the sobering note at the end about taking into account the means we do have. However, if I have understood correctly, for the European Union for the next programmation period has decided to invest some extra means, some increased fundings into the better targeting of shrinking areas. And I have a suspicion that Mr. Gløersen has some things to say about this.
I do indeed. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you to all. Good evening, good afternoon rather, and thank you for very interesting presentations today. I'm here mainly today in my capacity of having carried out a study for the European Commission on cohesion policy in shrinking areas, not only rural but also urban. And I just wanted to start by giving a few ideas of how this study came about, why the European Commission is looking into this, and what triggered them to do that. And that echoes what was just said by Wiktor Szydarowski on how can you approach this politically. The main reason for which the DG Regio then is looking into cohesion policy in areas with demographic decline is that two recitals made their way into the ERDF regulation for this programming period. These are recitals 1 and 45, and they say that particular attention should be paid with areas with population decline being identified as municipalities with at least 1% annual population decline between 2007 and 2017. I'll get back to what that implies, the map of those areas, in a few seconds. But the story behind how this came about can be a bit interesting. And the pressure, this came from negotiations between the Commission and the member states, and it was the Spanish delegation that triggered this change. And why Spain? Well, Spain has had something they call the revolt of empty Spain going since 2019. And in 2019, the Teruel party for shrinking areas, Teruel Existe, actually won a seat in the National Assembly and 2 seats in the Senate. So that's an important development. They start feeling the pressure from these areas politically. And if you followed recent news, you can have noted that the last Sunday, a few days ago, there was elections in Castilla-León, and another party, Soria Now, actually won another seat, and they have won a landslide victory in they won one seat in the regional assembly, and they actually won by landslide in their local area. So they took over this area with this movement, which is very much connected to this empty Spain movement. So politically, this is really there is a momentum there. And I don't think you can go and tell these people that you have to accept shrinkage. And that's the thing. Okay, we can say that in an abstract way. Now we're discussing among experts, but in concrete day-to-day politics, that doesn't exist. So that's something we can continue debating on, how you actually transform this idea of accepting shrinkage, accepting demographic change into policy debates. We then produced, well, I know you've had lots of maps today. I'll add one more to that list. We just tried to produce the map of the areas that actually correspond to the European Commission criteria. So these are the areas that would be shrinking from the perspective of this criterion of 1% annual decline of the European Commission. Just think it's interesting to have this as a mindset. This is the regulatory frame for working on this in the coming years. What we see then looking at the map is that the most hit states are Baltic states, Croatia, then the Iberian Peninsula. We have Finland, then comes Hungary, and a little bit low down Italy and Romania in terms of extent. You will see on the map that we still don't have data from Bulgaria and Greece. They finalized their census recently, so we'll have those data soon. I expect they will come pretty high in the list as well. So just on which maps, of course, note also that the size of municipalities is quite different. So the way there is a strong bias in how countries play out simply because municipalities are built differently in European countries and they have different sizes. So analytically, there is definitely a bias. If we translate this into what is the proportion of areas, like just in percentage, you see when the gradients I just showed you on the map. We see also the extent. You can note there that countries such as Hungary, but also Italy and Poland have quite a lot of municipalities with population decline that is not quite at the 1% level, this orange areas in this map. So that's also relevant to see, okay, the European Commission has one threshold, but looking beyond that threshold, well, there are definitely quite significant patterns to be taken into account in Hungary, Italy, and Poland, and some other countries. If we then now look at not an area with population decline, but proportion of population, we have some changes of which countries are most affected. Still, the Baltic countries are clearly on top, closely followed by Croatia and Hungary. And then the Iberian Peninsula comes a little bit further down, as they have their sparsely populated areas are a bit less populated. So still just giving you the frameworks of how this European Commission criterion would play out in the different European countries and which countries then appear on top. Still keeping in mind that we do not have data for Bulgaria, Greece, and also Cyprus. Okay, so how does this then integrate into the EU discourse? There is a connection to this notion of geographies of discontent, of where do EU skeptic voting take place. Admittedly, Louis Dijkstra, Hugo Pohlmann produced a report in 2018 on this geographies of discontent, and their conclusion was that there wasn't a strong connection between population decline and EU skeptic vote. However, they used data at the NUTS 3 levels, the regional level. I'm not sure the result would be confirmed if you look at municipal population trends. So we should be a bit careful about that. But there is definitely in the discourse, in the whole discussion of this issue, there is a connection to shrinkage and possibility of populist movements, EU skeptic vote, etc. And also a connection to the just transition mechanism, so the whole just transition fund, and their focus on places left behind in this transition process. There are, but this is not the only reason is not just to avoid EU skepticism. There is also the idea that these areas can be important for Europe as a whole in terms of natural resources, for example, biomass, in our capacity to mitigate climate change, in the high cost of actually providing essential services. If the EU states that some services should be available to all, having areas with very low population density is an additional cost. As has mentioned before, it's a notion of quality of life, of socially dysfunctional communities potentially emerging or developing. There is a question of ecosystem services that may require some level of human presence. And there are notions of preservation of cultural heritage. So many different dimensions there, which are component of this interest from the EU level into shrinking areas. I think I will go quickly on this difference. Well, we focused a lot on rural areas today, but there are also issues in urban areas with urban decline. And just as the EU is merging these two, it can be important to see, okay, what makes them a bit different. And then rural is this critical issue of falling below critical thresholds. And in urban areas where it's more linked to social segregation, derelict neighborhood, brownfield, so different kinds of issue into the same notion of shrinking areas. On the wording, we've used today this notion of shrinking areas, which has not been so widely used so far. We've heard about shrinking cities quite a bit, but not shrinking areas generically. So that's a bit new. And I think it's important to emphasize what this brings into the debate. I very much liked Elizabeth Stick's comments on the narratives, on the wording we use. And in Europe, we hear a lot the word depopulation. And I'm a bit skeptical of using that term. You get the idea that the areas are being drained. The population is just disappearing. And it's rather thinning out. It's progressive. People actually move back in. A lot move back in, significant numbers. So keeping that in mind. And this is something I'll show you a bit examples maybe later on. The depopulation is used everywhere, and that's something maybe to be challenged, to this use of the depopulation wording all the time. And also pointing out that this is a process which is self-reinforcing, sharing this understanding about policymakers, that this reinforces itself. So if you don't act there is no political action, you will just see it becoming stronger and stronger in many of these areas. And we've talked a lot today, now echoing what was said on the need to say sometimes population decline cannot be avoided, but it's always a social trauma, and this needs accompanying. So do we use the word mitigation or accompanying? I'm just raising the issue. What is best suited in the policy debate? I'm a little bit about mitigation, which is very much in climate these days. And do we mitigate really, or are we really just accompanying people into in a difficult situation and exerting solidarity? So should we prefer mitigation or accompanying? I'm very much, well, the key issues, well, now just as the study was now given to me to carry out, the key issues we were looking at is very much connected to what you discussed earlier. Can we adapt the growth rhetoric of the ERDF, of the Regional Development Fund, to shrinking areas? We came to the same questions that were just raised on what objectives are relevant, what are realistic, which is politically acceptable, then accompanying, stabilizing, smart shrinkings, or promoting demographic or economic growth in all areas. So that's what can you pursue. Once you've chosen a given objective, what are the bottlenecks to achieve them? And knowing that we have program areas which are very large, NUTS 2 regions often, then do you actually have the leeway to adapt the general idea of an EU program to the specific situation of a shrinking area? Is it possible within the programs? And lastly, the European Commission wanted very much to look into what happened in 2014, 2020. Do we actually have practices in these areas which you can play on? This hasn't been targeted explicitly, but we can still have a lot of very useful practices that we should need to share, to learn from, to learn what went well, what went wrong, what could we do better? So that was the last question. So I hope I'll be able to get back to this a bit later in the discussion on the more details on what we actually did. But I just wanted to frame a bit how this discussion emerged at the Commission level and share with you the idea that this is actually an active discussion with the European Commission, where surprisingly a lot of high level of interest among national desks. So I was personally surprised by how many people were actually interested in this issue among the national desks at DG Regio. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for all the questions you raised. Honestly, also for the fact you highlighted the plain fact that the question of shrinking areas is not just an academic debate of the type we have been pursuing for most of this conference, but also an institutional and political question, and that the way it is envisioned depends on an institutional and political point of view. And that gives me an opportunity to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Toth, who does not come from directly from the EU regional policy circles, not to say bubble, and who may be able to give a slightly different perspective on the question and to highlight the perspective of the European Network for Rural Development on those questions.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank you for having me in this panel discussion. I found the presentations and discussions of the day very interesting. Yes, exactly. I would like to offer a different type of perspective, a slightly different one, and that is looking at all this debate and all this discussion from a networker point of view. I'm working for the European Network for Rural Development, which is a policy network, and our job is to actually accompany, help, support, knowledge exchange, sharing of good practices, knowledge development as well in relation to the implementation of the European Rural Development Policy. So we are working directly with European rural development stakeholders, starting from the local level to the administrative higher levels like national and EU levels as well, and regional as well. So our meetings really feature usually quite diverse groups of stakeholders, sometimes coming from research institutes as well, local development agencies, local development groups, municipalities, ministries, national rural networks. So all these types of perspectives are shared and are there in our meetings. So there are four things that I would like to talk about today.
Just before you
yes.
do, I'm very sorry for interrupting you, but your microphone saturates a bit when you speak loud. So if you could just, if you have another microphone at hand and can connect it to be perfect.
I try another one. Just a second.
Sorry to rob everyone for this. No, we don't hear you at all. So I believe you should.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Is this slightly better? I hope. Actually, some of the noise is caused by my laptop. For some reason, I don't know why. It's the ventilation system.
Okay, let's not delve on it. Sorry, 4 things you wanted to.
Okay. Yes, basically, yes. First was about the perspective. So this is not a researcher's perspective. This is not a local development practitioner's perspective, but rather a networker's perspective. So what we are learning from all of this is based on practice done in different EU member states at the local and sub-regional or regional levels. The second is I would like to mention some policy tools that came to my mind when I heard all the presentations about either depopulation or vertical or horizontal coordination, cooperation, trust, all these types of ideas come to mind when I think about these policy tools that I will mention. I will also mention some governance aspects, and finally, I would like to share some practical examples with you, if that's okay. So when I was listening to the debates today and the presentations today associated with shrinkage, the first comment is that in the practitioners' discussions that we have, we usually use the word depopulation. So that's the underuse of the terms and terminology and concepts. But we understand this to be related to loss of population, associated with lack of services, restructured local economy, changes in the local economy, all sorts of changes, migration come into play, and we understand the different contexts as well. When I heard about multi-level governance, territorial specificities, and targeting, 2 specific tools, policy tools, came to my mind, which are widely used all over Europe. One of them has been there for more than 30 years, that is leader and community-led local development. And the other is the smart village concept or smart villages initiatives that are sort of picking up in popularity, and more member states are embracing this approach. So what's common about these, and what's very important about these? Maybe I will start with the leader approach, because it's very important to understand that this is based on 7 key principles, and all these 7 key principles have one central function, and this central function is to support and promote the development of space-based local solutions. So the 7 principles are sub-regional territories. So these are sub-regional territories working together in public-private partnerships, what we call local action groups. These local action groups together, they comprise of public and private partners locally, and they set up and develop a community-led local development strategy together, which has to have innovative elements in the local context. So that's also very important, innovation, locality. And these have to be accessible to the local population, to the local stakeholders. So that's related to the bottom-up approach. And another thing that's very important, there has to be cooperation within the local action group territory, but also between these different local action groups. And networking is a key element. So just to demonstrate the scale of this, there are more than 3,100 local action groups in our database only. There are about 3,500 local action groups all over the EU, operating in rural and coastal areas, and there are also rural-urban partnerships. So that has kind of a high scale, and all these principles are enshrined in the EU regulation. They have been part of the EU regulations on the common provisions regulation, also the European Agriculture and Rural Development Fund regulations. So these are the principles that are at the core, but here comes a very, very important aspect of developing these space-based and local solutions, that these local action groups do not operate in a vacuum. They operate in a sort of a delivery framework where there are ministries, managing authorities, the EU, national rural networks, all these come into play. And what's very important is that to enable these local action groups to provide real and practical answers, you need to have simple access to the administrative framework. So that's one of the things that has been mentioned a few times today. But in terms of access to resources for local development, especially, or at least in my experience, it is very, very important that if you have local players, these local action groups, they have to be enabled to deliver added value at the local level. And one of the key aspects of it is a simple, accessible delivery framework, meaning the rules, procedures, funding, the allocation of resources, all that has to be right. So we are also doing special work on that, and I will share some links later. So that relates to horizontal and vertical coordination and cooperation. So vertical meaning from the local level to the national ministries, managing authorities and paying agencies, making sure that the policy works in terms of reasonableness of funding and costs and the proper use of public funding also. That's very important. So that's one element. And indeed, some of these local action groups from some of these areas of Europe, which we know of, and we have had different workshops and seminars and group work based on this, have developed local solutions of different scales with the aim of tackling what we say depopulation. So in the networking, rural development networking, the shrinkage word is not so much used yet, not so much known. We use depopulation, as you will see from the examples. So we are also working on supporting the long-term vision of rural areas that has been mentioned today. And there are currently 2 thematic groups already running. One of them is on rural revitalization. I will share the links to that. And this rural revitalization thematic group is aiming to understand the key enabling conditions that drive rural revitalization. So that's one of the main objectives. And the second one is to help to shape the future rural revitalization platform that will be is being developed by the European Commission. I see Alexia has shared the link to that. Thank you very much for this. And the other thematic group is on rural proofing. that the ENRD has launched. And that's also a very important initiative, because we need to look at how the different national or regional or even EU policies are sort of proved in terms of how they address rural issues. And that I find it also a very important initiative. So some examples, I just very briefly about some examples, because to demonstrate the different scales of what is happening. And there are hundreds of examples on our website. So if you are interested, you will be able to browse a little bit based on the links that I provide. So for example, let's start with a more something coming more from the academia. Like the Lisbon University in Portugal developed a rural investor guide, or a white book for young rural entrepreneurs who want to start businesses in rural areas, just to help them with all the startup phases, to make it easy to locate your business, to settle your business, to develop your business and set up your business in a rural area. That was one type of initiative. In a border region with Belgium in Western Germany, and this was a low-scale, very local initiative, a local action group supported setting up an intergenerational cooperative, which actually provided services to both the young and the old generations. For example, really practical things like childcare before and after kindergarten hours for young professionals who cannot solve this problem. And this sort of institutional service doesn't exist, for example, or transport and shopping services for the elderly, or supporting their homes and basic domestic support. So this is just a small project, but it illustrates what can be done locally with what we call a place-based solution, by looking at the practical problems that exist. Then there were in remote Finland, a digital hub or community space was developed for the elderly in some villages. So that's another interesting example. Or in Spain, there was a project titled Odiseo, which aims to bring back the young people to rural areas through training and information workshops, and also internships in rural companies. And this was a little bit bigger. It managed to reach more than 2,000 young people all over some areas of Spain in education institutions. Or let's look at legislative measures. For example, in Spain, Castilla-La Mancha, this is a recent example, they made a special legislation, a law on economic, social, and tax measures against depopulation and for the development of rural areas of Castilla-La Mancha. And this is also a good example of horizontal coordination between different regional ministries in that specific region of Castilla-La Mancha. So there are several examples, and also, as I mentioned, smart villages initiatives are coming up. Those are more community-based, like one smart village initiative may be one village actually, and they are looking at very local specific problems. But the main common objective of these is to improve the quality of life in specific rural communities, whether at the level of one village only at a time, or at the level of a local action group, or looking at specific target groups like the youth or people wanting to move back to rural areas, or the elderly. What I would say is the common denominator about all of these is improving the quality of life in rural areas, probably making rural areas more attractive to stay in or to move into. And I'm going to share some links in the chat for some specific examples and workshop conclusions and things like this, if it's okay. That's all from me for now, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think Erik had a question or a remark or a contribution to make on this topic.
No, I was just struck by now we're talking about rural development, we're talking about shrinkage, and it seemed now, listening to Péter, very interesting initiatives all over, but how do these things meet? Many rural areas are very dynamic demographically, and we have shrinking cities, shrinking urban areas, and I'm just wondering what makes sense in terms of policy design of merging this into the rural or trying to keep it separate? Or how do we think this connection between urban rural shrinking? We have three notions there which are intertwined. I was just wondering a bit about this connection.
It is interesting indeed that, if I'm not mistaken, I'm just a student, the concept of shrinkage originated in urban studies, but it's interesting to see that within the EU networks have become very closely associated with rural development questions. We have 20 minutes left, and I think it would be interesting to keep discussing this theme a bit further, even if it means cutting back on other teams, because we have a discussion going. So, Péter and Toth, Péter, I think you had a contribution, of course, Wiktor.
Yes, I just wanted, thank you. I just wanted to react to what Erik has raised. And I think, yes, it's a fact that shrinking or depopulation happens in rural areas, both, and in urban areas as well. All the examples are coming from my limited experience only. So that's why I was talking about this from the rural perspective, the perspective of rural areas. I think that it would be an interesting discussion to talk about whether it belongs to rural policy or not, or both policies. I think what's most important is this notion of space-based, this notion of the diversity of the problem in the local specificities of the problem, and how these can be reflected in the interventions. So that for me, that would capture, maybe it's because I'm working with Leader and Smart Villages, but this is sort of the core of the essence of there are no two local action groups which are the same. All the strategies have something in common, of course. A lot of them promote tourism and small business development, and all these kinds of things are there. But the specific problems can be very, very different in different parts of Europe, and even different neighboring communities or neighboring local action groups. So I think this space-based focus, local focus, giving voice to the local communities is very, very important in designing real solutions. And it provides also a very good reality check, which is very important, because you cannot, I mean, if you design a policy which nobody will implement, it may sound fine, but it won't work. So it has to be, owned by the people.
Only 2 times the conference, okay. Thank you for this reminder of the importance of acceptability and appropriation of policies by local actors. And I think I just have to leave the floor to Mr. Szydarowski.
Yes, I'm actually following the quite interesting exchange in the chat section about the terms, and I understand that the term shrinking or shrinkage could cause confusion, because we may immediately associate it with the population, and I would understand the population as one of the parameters, of course, for shrinking that we need to pay attention to when understanding which areas are potentially shrinking or not. But I would rather capture this term shrinking as the area that is not able to capitalize on its assets. Because another confusion that we can see is that, well, some people may say the area is losing population, but it's still vibrant. It still has this vitality, as Péter is writing here. This also inspired with Péter's contribution, that you might have some small areas that matter, that develop, that grow, that actually, even though they lose population, they may have the certain offer to the people, that we are coherent, socially coherent, we can build on our, say, assets, we understand our capital, and we actually have a proposition for you. So this is something I'd like to pitch with you, actually, how to understand shrinkage. Is it, as I suggest, maybe an inability of the areas to grow on the certain territorial assets, no matter that the population size and the population tendency? This could bring probably a deeper context of this, scaling the phenomenon of shrinkage. Again, something very fresh I would like to leave for this discussion and then for the works. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gløersen?
Yeah, I didn't dwell on the definition. I realized this is more important than I thought. I had a slide I jumped on. I personally, in my study for the commission, chose defining shrinkage as an area's population decline is perceived as a component of a social and/or economic crisis. And this definition comes from shrinking cities. And I think it applies quite well generally of this notion of shrinkage as being when it's associated to some kind of crisis. And then going on to smart shrinkage is overcoming this crisis. So yeah, then we take out these situations where you may have population decline with economic vitality for other reasons, like change of economic need for less employees, etc. So I think that's the first statement. I don't know if I had some other slides to show, but I wanted to emphasize also this notion that this is conceptualized effectively in the member states. In Portugal, they talk about the inland. In Spain, they talk about the rural areas. In Sweden and Finland, talk about sparsely populated areas. In Latvia or Lithuania or Poland, they think of population decline as a component of, Latvia, Lithuania, as a national crisis. I mean, this is not a local phenomenon, it's a national phenomenon with some implications locally. I think this is just important because we are now at the EU level talking about keeping in mind, we are talking to people who have a mental picture of what this is, which is completely with their own terminology and idea of how this is, they represent it, what it implies, and the whole idea of what the causal factors are, which are very different from each country to country also. They have an idea of what causes this, which is well embedded in the national discourse. So we have to construct this notion of shrinkage at the EU level to be able to talk to the national and regional levels. This is not established. We did it in the EU study at 9 member states, but this should be studied across to really understand how do you understand population decline in the countries that are concerned by this. Last thing is when you look at national strategies, some countries are explicitly saying we want to reverse population decline. I'm typically thinking of Spain and Italy. Countries like Sweden and Finland, they say, no, we are not doing that. We want to have knowledge-based development. And if it works, great, then we will have a stabilized population. If they don't manage to have knowledge-based development, then so be it. And so very different stances there on what the objective are. And countries like Poland or Lithuania, they are saying if we don't manage to reverse population decline, our growth is going to be limited. So it's a very different way of approaching the whole objective and the reason for which you have the objective.
Thank you very much for this intervention. In the second part of this roundtable, I had in mind